Welcome to this module on setting goals and objectives for standards-based ESL and EFL instruction, an important aspect of planning literacy instruction for our English learners. As such, our objectives for this module, therefore, are to be able to create standards-based and effective second and foreign language literacy lesson objectives and to map out the skills we target within a curriculum unit. In order to begin the process of planning for effective ESL or EFL literacy instruction, we must remind ourselves of what informs our instructional practices. Recall from our first night of class that ESL and EFL literacy instruction should focus on the bottom-up, top-down, interactive, and process-oriented skills instruction. This means we must provide meaning-focused input or text and literacy events that are one level above students' current levels of English proficiency in order for them to grow their language skills. We also must provide opportunities for students to produce meaning-focused output or discussion or writing activities based on the input they receive. And lastly, we must create opportunities for language-focused learning, also known as grammar and vocabulary acquisition, as well as fluency development that allows the students to revisit and strengthen these skills. The input, output, and language we use in class should also be informed by the literacy needs our students have relating to the teaching context, the program or curriculum requirements, learners' individual needs, as well as their language proficiency levels. With all this taken into account, our lessons should then target the reading, writing, and vocabulary skills that are, as stated earlier, one level above learners' current level of English proficiency and provide models and scaffolds to rise the students' levels of language to this higher level of proficiency. In order to achieve all these tenets of effective ESL or EFL instruction, we must be purposeful, organized, and hold a long view for what we teach in the classroom. This means we need to situate our daily instruction within a larger curriculum scope and sequence. A curriculum scope refers to an outline of what we will teach our students, in other words, the content and skills of a course. The sequence then refers to the order in which we present the course content and skills. Therefore, our curriculum scope and sequence is like an outline of our course goals and objectives. A language program's curriculum standards or frameworks is a good place to start when thinking about a curriculum scope and sequence. Standards provide us with the broad and important reading, writing, and vocabulary outcomes that have already been vetted by experts and practitioners in order to ensure program quality. The language of literacy standards allow for instructors to create their own unit goals and lesson objectives tailored to the zones of proximal development of their particular classroom of learners, while still keeping the long view of the curriculum scope and sequence in mind. So when we sit down to plan instruction for ESL and EFL classes, we can use standards to map out the skills we will develop over the duration of the course. A skills map outlines the standards, goals, and objectives of the curriculum scope and sequence. We start this mapping process by first identifying the standard or standards appropriate for the course we are teaching. For pre-K through 12 classrooms, the Massachusetts curriculum frameworks are organized by academic subject and grade level and the literacy outcomes expected for children and teens in their respective grades. For adult ESL and for EFL teaching, standards are often organized around language proficiency levels. For example, the student performance levels and the CEFRs. It is also important to note that standards are incredibly broad and encompass a range of sub-skills. So from the standard, we can create what's called unit goals. A unit goal chunks the broader standard down and usually relates to the literacy events we are developing through the course. A unit usually consists of several lessons in which we then develop specific lesson objectives that teach, model, and practice the specific literacy practices that support the bigger literacy event. In other words, lesson objectives are specifically what students will be able to do after the lesson is complete. These objectives should have an accessible and directly observable outcome that shows students how they are achieving the bigger goals and broader standards of the curriculum scope and sequence. As such, we often see lesson objectives start with a standard phrase such as, "Students will be able to." Figure 2 on this slide shows the hierarchy and narrowing of the standard down to the unit goals and ultimately the lesson objectives. So here's an example of using a standard to map out literacy skills. Notice how we go from the broad skill of writing an informative or explanatory text down to the general goals of using multiple sources to support writing and writing a biography, then down to setting specific lesson objectives that help students to acquire the literacy practices related to these goals and standard. Let's zero in then on what makes an effective literacy objective, since objectives form the basis for our daily lessons. An effective objective is tied to the standard it uses. Sometimes you can even borrow language from the standards or unit goals and rephrase them in more specific terms, as you can see in my examples on the previous slide. Objectives should also be easily accessible and directly observable, meaning that we can measure students' learning and see their learning through an assignment, task, or assessment tied to the objective. Consequently, effective literacy objectives relate to a specific literacy practice, such as reading, writing, vocabulary, study skills, grammar, etc., and it should be as specific as possible. Good objectives also start with student-centered and student-friendly phrases like "students will be able to" or "we will be able to," followed by a phrase that uses an active verb to capture the literacy practice. An active verb is a verb that specifies a language or literacy function. Verbs like respond, describe, or explain are directly tied to specific literacy practices and higher order skills. Non-active verbs such as understand or know are vague in nature and are difficult to observe in our students. On this slide, you can see a sampling of active verbs that can be used in crafting literacy lesson objectives. In summary, effective instructional planning practices always keeps a curriculum scope and sequence in view. Using curriculum standards or frameworks to map out the literacy skills we wish to target helps us to stay organized and focus our instruction on our learners' needs. A skills map also aids us in adhering to an appropriate curriculum scope and sequence. Only by having this whole picture view can we then craft clear, observable, and accessible lesson objectives that develop English learners' literacy practices and help them to navigate various literacy events. So now it is time to practice mapping out the various skills that will be targeted within your literacy model curriculum unit. For this task, your skills map should be visual or graphic in nature, for example, not in narrative form. In your visual, you should include the standard or standards your unit will meet, the goal or literacy event that your unit engages in, the lesson objectives or the literacy practices that you will teach. Your skills map should indicate the sequence in which these skills should be presented to the students. You should also draw from your description of the unit context that you developed for Module 1 and include this description as a cover page to your map. You may use my example as a guide for what your map could look like in the end, but by no means do you have to use the same format of a flowchart. Also, there is no minimum or maximum for the number of standards, goals, or objectives presented, but do know that many times less is more when it comes to standards and goals, as these are quite broad and general in nature. Lastly, you may use the Smart Art feature in Microsoft Word or PowerPoint as an easy way of creating graphics, or you may choose to use another online tool such as Prezi. You may even hand draw the skills map and upload a picture if you so choose to do so. Have fun!